In the autumn of 1888, the Union Pacific Railroad deposited Eleanor Vance at the edge of nowhere, a place the map called Promise, Wyoming. It was a name that felt like a cruel joke. Her brother-in-law, a man of cold Boston accounts who had never once met her gaze, had sent her west with a one-way ticket and a curt letter of introduction to a widower in need of a housekeeper. The world, or at least the small, suffocating world she had known, called her a burden. A spinster at 42, made plain by grief and penniless by her late husband's debts, she was a problem to be solved, a column to be cleared from a ledger. But what her brother-in-law, in his neat and ordered cruelty, did not know, what the world could not see, was that Eleanor carried a resilience forged in quiet rooms and forgotten corners. It was a strength that did not announce itself, but endured, like the tough prairie grass that bent in the wind but did not break. This is her story, a tale of what the world called useless and what a man of dust and sky would come to call his own. The man waiting beside the station platform was carved from the landscape itself. His name was Silas Blackwood, and he was as weathered as the raw lumber of the small depot. He did not smile. He did not offer condolences for the life she had lost or pleasantries about her journey. He simply took the worn handle of her single carpet bag, his knuckles scarred and brown, and nodded toward a buckboard wagon. "Ma'am," he said, the word a low sound, almost carried away by the ceaseless wind. She looked at him, truly looked. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, pale and startling in a face tanned by a relentless sun. They held no pity, a mercy for which she was profoundly grateful. They held only a quiet, steady assessment. He was measuring her, she knew, not for her beauty or her breeding, but for her capacity to withstand. The silence on the ride to his ranch was vast, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the rhythmic plodding of the horses. Eleanor watched the land unspool around them, an immense empty canvas of sage and dust that stretched to a horizon so distant it seemed to belong to another world. It was a place that could swallow a person whole. She felt her own smallness, a familiar ache of insignificance. She had been sent here to disappear, and she feared this land would grant that wish all too easily. The Blackwood Ranch was not a place of comfort. It was a testament to necessity, a collection of stark, functional buildings hunkered low against the wind. The house itself was timber and sod, solid and unadorned, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the unending plains. Dust, fine as sifted flour, coated everything, a constant reminder of the encroaching wilderness. Inside, the main room was clean but spare, dominated by a stone hearth and a long wooden table. It was a man's house, orderly in its own way, but absent of any touch that spoke of softness or of home. Two children stood near the cold stove, a boy of about 10 and a girl perhaps 2 years younger. They were as silent and watchful as their father, their gazes missing the open curiosity of childhood. They had the old solemn eyes of those who had known loss too early. The boy Jacob gave a stiff nod. The girl, Sarah, hid behind her brother's arm, a whisper of a child with hair the color of dried straw. Silas set her bag down by the door. "The arrangement is for room and board," he stated, his voice even, transactional, "and $10 a month. You'll see to the children and the house. Mending, cleaning, the usual." He gestured toward a small closed door. "That will be your room." It was all she could have hoped for. It was less than she had feared. Yet the weight of the word arrangement settled upon her. She was a line item, a necessary expense. Her worth was measured in dollars and chores. The shame she carried, the familiar companion of her widowhood, curled in her stomach. Her hands, pale and soft from a life of turning pages and light needlework, felt useless and foreign in this place of hard, practical labor. She looked at the cast-iron stove, a black, hulking beast, and felt a fresh wave of inadequacy. She was an imposter here, a woman of letters in a world that demanded calluses. The first evening descended quickly, the sun dropping below the horizon and leaving the sky a bruised purple. The wind picked up, a mournful sound that seeped through the cracks in the walls. Silas lit a kerosene lamp, casting long, dancing shadows that made the small room feel even larger and emptier. He moved to the stove, his motions economical and sure, adding wood to the firebox. He pulled out a heavy skillet and a slab of bacon. Eleanor stood frozen, a spectator in the space she was meant to command. The children sat at the table, their small faces illuminated by the flickering light, watching her. They were waiting. He was waiting. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken expectation. This was to be her domain, the kitchen, the hearth, the heart of a home. A heart she did not know how to operate. She had spent her life in the service of others, as a daughter, a wife, a companion to a wealthy aunt. She could read Latin and argue philosophy. She could embroider a passable sampler and play the pianoforte with delicate precision. She could manage a household budget and write a perfectly crafted letter. But her mother, a woman who believed a lady's hands were for decoration, had never taught her the alchemy of the kitchen. Her own brief marriage had been one of city living, of meals taken in modest restaurants or prepared by a landlady. The kitchen was as foreign to her as the surface of the moon. The smell of wood smoke and bacon began to fill the room. Silas did not look at her, but she felt his awareness of her stillness, her uselessness. Every second that passed was an indictment. She had to speak. She had to confess her fraudulence before he discovered it himself. She cleared her throat, but the sound was lost in the crackle of the fire. She tried again, her voice a thin, reedy thing. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, the words catching on the lump of humiliation in her throat. He stopped slicing the bacon and turned, his pale eyes finding hers in the dim light. He waited. "There is something you should know," she forced herself to continue, her gaze dropping to the worn floorboards. "A failing in my domestic education, a significant one." The admission hung in the air, the sum of all her inadequacies. She braced herself for the inevitable response, the cold dismissal, the weary sigh, the quiet calculation of how soon he could take her back to the station in promise. She was a housekeeper who could not keep the most essential part of a house. "I can't cook," she confessed. The words were barely a whisper, yet they seemed to echo in the sudden, profound silence. The fire popped. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Silas Blackwood just stood there, holding the knife, his expression unreadable. Eleanor kept her eyes down, studying the intricate patterns of dust and grime on the floor, waiting for the verdict. She felt the hot blush of shame creep up her neck. She had traveled 2,000 miles under false pretenses. Then she heard a low sound. It was not a scoff or a sigh. It was a quiet exhalation, almost a chuckle. She risked a glance upward. A slow smile was spreading across his face. A thing so unexpected it was like seeing a crack of light in a stone wall. It transformed him, softening the harsh lines carved by sun and sorrow, making his eyes crinkle at the corners. "Good," he said, the word a low, warm rumble that seemed to settle the very air in the room. He turned back to the skillet, laying the strips of bacon in the hot iron with a satisfying sizzle. He glanced over his shoulder at her, his smile lingering. "I'm tired of my own recipes." That single word, good, was a gift. It was an absolution she had not known she was desperate for. He had not dismissed her. He had not shamed her. He had, in his own spare way, accepted her. The tight knot of fear in her chest loosened, just a fraction. It was not about the cooking, she realized. It was about the truth. She had offered him her greatest failing, and he had not turned her away. In that moment, a tiny, fragile seed of something like hope took root in the barren soil of her heart. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. Eleanor did not cook. Silas continued to prepare the meals, simple, repetitive fare of bacon, beans, salt pork, and a dense, heavy bread he baked once a week. He never mentioned her confession again. He simply accepted the new division of labor as if it had always been so. She, in turn, threw herself into the work she could do. She waged a silent, determined war on the dust, scrubbing the floors until the pale wood shone, washing the grime from the windows until the vast landscape outside seemed sharper, clearer. She mended the children's clothes with neat, almost invisible stitches, her needle a familiar comfort in her hand. She organized the pantry, sorted through tangled fishing lines and disorganized tools, bringing a quiet order to the masculine chaos of the house. One afternoon, in a small trunk at the foot of Silas's bed, she found them. Books. Not the practical almanacs or ledgers she expected, but a small, treasured collection of novels and poetry. Dickens, Hawthorne, a slim volume of Keats. The pages were soft with use, the bindings worn. They had belonged to his wife. She felt a pang of intrusion, of trespassing on sacred ground. She closed the trunk gently, but the knowledge of the book stayed with her. That evening, after Silas had cleared away the supper dishes, she found the courage to speak. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice soft, "I noticed some books. The children—" She trailed off, unsure how to continue. He looked at his son and daughter, who were staring into the fire, their faces listless. "They don't read much," he said, his tone flat. "Their mother used to." The mention of his wife was a stone dropped into a still pool, the ripples of her absence spreading through the room. "Perhaps," Eleanor offered, her heart beating a little faster, "if you would permit it, I could read to them in the evenings." He considered this for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the children and back again. "All right," he said finally. So she began. She started with a book of animal fables she found tucked away. Her voice, at first hesitant, grew stronger as she lost herself in the stories. Jacob, who had been sullen and withdrawn, began to inch closer to the fire each night. Sarah, who rarely spoke, would watch Eleanor's face, her eyes wide, mesmerized by the rise and fall of her voice. Silas would sit in his chair in the corner, ostensibly cleaning a rifle or mending a piece of tack, but she knew he was listening. The sound of her reading filled the silence that grief had left behind, stitching the four of them together in the warm bubble of firelight. Weeks passed. The house began to change in subtle ways. One day, Sarah silently placed a jar of hardy purple wildflowers on the table. Another day, Jacob asked Eleanor to help him spell the word coyote. The house began to feel less like a shelter and more like a home. Silas noticed. He noticed the way the lamplight now gleamed on polished wood. He noticed the smell of soap and lavender that clung to the mended curtains. Most of all, he noticed the sound of his children's laughter, a sound he had thought was lost to him forever. He began to see Eleanor not as his housekeeper, but as a quiet, steady presence that was slowly, inexplicably healing his broken family. The work of the ranch was relentless, a constant battle against the elements in the unforgiving land. Eleanor learned that her worth here was not measured by the softness of her hands, but by their willingness to become hard. She scrubbed laundry on a washboard until her knuckles were raw, the lye soap stinging in 1,000 tiny cuts. She learned to haul water from the well, the bite of the rope leaving deep red grooves in her palms. She started a small kitchen garden near the house, coaxing stubborn life from the dry, packed earth. Her hands, once the pale, delicate instruments of a Boston lady, became chapped, calloused, and strong. She looked at them one evening, noting a broken nail in the fine web of new scars, and felt not shame, but a strange and unfamiliar flicker of pride. One morning, Silas found her struggling with a broken latch on the chicken coop, her frustration mounting with each failed attempt. He came and stood beside her, not taking the tools from her, but speaking in his low, patient way. "Here," he said, "angle the hammer so. Let the tool do the work." He placed his large, rough hand over hers, guiding the motion. His touch was brief, impersonal, a teacher's touch, but a jolt of warmth shot up her arm. It was the first time they had touched. He showed her how to brace the wood, how to set the nail, his instructions direct and respectful. He did not treat her as a fragile woman, but as a capable partner. Another day, he decided she should learn to ride. He chose the gentlest mare, a placid, older horse named Daisy. He did not lift her into the saddle as some gentlemen might have. Instead, he showed her how to place her foot in the stirrup, how to use her own strength to swing herself up. "You have to feel the horse," he said, his hands adjusting her grip on the reins. "She'll tell you what she's thinking, if you listen." They rode out together, not far at first, just to the crest of a low rise that overlooked the ranch. The world looked different from the back of a horse, vaster and yet more manageable. He pointed out landmarks, the creek that was their boundary to the east, the distant smudge of mountains to the west. He was sharing his world with her, not just the house, but the land itself. In these small, shared moments of labor, a new intimacy grew between them, an understanding that needed no words. He was teaching her his language, the language of work, of the land, of survival. And she, in turn, was teaching him hers, the language of stories, of quiet order, of a steadfast presence that asked for nothing but a place to be. The first trip into the town of Promise was a trial. As they walked toward the mercantile, Eleanor felt the weight of curious eyes. In a place this small, a new face was an event, and an unmarried woman living in a widower's house was a scandal waiting to be written. The whispers followed them like rustling leaves. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smells of coffee beans, cured leather, and gossip. A woman with a face like a clenched fist and hair pulled into a severe bun detached herself from a group of other women. She was Mrs. Gable, the store owner's wife and the town's self-appointed arbiter of moral conduct. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice sharp and unnaturally sweet, "and this must be your new help." Her eyes swept over Eleanor, a quick, dismissive inventory that took in her plain dress, her worn boots, and her tired face. Eleanor felt herself shrink under the woman's gaze. "This is Mrs. Vance," Silas said, his tone clipped. "Of course, Mrs." Gable purred. "I do hope she's settling in. A house with children needs a woman's touch. A good hand with a skillet is a blessing, isn't it?" The question was aimed at Silas, but the barb was meant for Eleanor. The other women twittered, their eyes bright with malice. The old shame, the familiar ghost, rose up to choke her. She was an imposter, a failure, a woman who could not perform the most basic of female duties. She could feel the hot blush spreading across her cheeks and wish the floor would open up and swallow her. She fully expected Silas to make some polite, non-committal agreement to distance himself from her inadequacy in the face of public opinion. Instead, he was silent for a beat. He looked directly at Mrs. Gable, his pale eyes cold as river ice. "Mrs. Vance's hands have brought more good to my home than any skillet ever could," he said, his voice low and steady. He then turned to her. "Eleanor, did you need anything else?" He had used her given name. He had defended her. He had, in his own quiet way, drawn a line in the dust and placed himself on her side of it. The whispers died. Mrs. Gable's mouth snapped shut. Silas paid for their supplies and they left the store. The silence behind them more telling than any words. On the long ride back to the ranch, the silence in the wagon was different. It was not empty, but full. Eleanor stared at her own hands, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. She felt raw, exposed, but also fiercely, strangely protected. She had braced herself for his anger, his embarrassment. As they crested the last hill and the ranch came into view, he finally spoke, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Mrs. Gable's tongue is sharper than her husband's knives," he said, his voice rough. "Pay it no mind." It was not a grand speech. It was not a declaration of affection, but it was everything. It was an anchor in the swirling waters of her self-doubt. He saw her, he saw the work she did, and he valued it. He valued her. In the face of the world's judgment, he had stood with her. The arrangement was no longer just an arrangement. It was an alliance. Winter descended not as a gentle blanket of snow, but as a hard white fist. The wind, which had been a constant companion, became a howling beast, piling drifts against the north side of the house and rattling the window panes. The world shrank, its boundaries contracting to the four walls of the small cabin. They were isolated, a tiny island of warmth and light in a sea of frozen white. The enforced proximity should have been a strain, but instead it wove them closer. The rhythms of their life became more intimate. The small cabin was filled with the sounds of their shared existence, the scratch of Jacob's pencil as Eleanor helped him with his sums, the soft thud of Sarah's ragdoll falling to the floor, the steady rasp of Silas oiling a piece of harness by the fire. One evening, a blizzard raged outside, erasing the world in a blur of driving snow. The children were asleep in their small loft room. The only sounds were the roar of the wind and the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Eleanor was reading. The book of Keats she had found in the trunk held close to the lamplight. She was so lost in the words that she didn't notice Silas watching her until he spoke. "What is it that holds you so?" he asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Startled, she looked up. "Poetry," she answered, feeling a little foolish. "It's a comfort." He nodded, his gaze on the flames. My wife, Mary, she loved books. Said they were windows, a way to see a world bigger than this valley. It was the most he had ever said about her. He spoke of her not with the sharp edge of fresh grief, but with a quiet, settled sorrow. Eleanor found her voice. Where I came from in Boston, books were everything. They were my education, my friends. She told him about her father, a professor who had believed his daughter's mind was as worthy of cultivation as any son's. She spoke of the life she had known, a life of quiet libraries and intellectual debate, a world so far removed from this one it felt like a dream. He listened, his head tilted, his expression thoughtful. He did not judge her past or her softness. He simply listened. When she fell silent, he stood and went to the trunk at the foot of his bed. He returned with a different book, its leather cover dark and supple with age. He held it out to her. It was a copy of Jane Eyre. This was her favorite, he said. Mary's. She must have read it a dozen times. Eleanor took the book, her fingers tracing the worn cover. It was a profound gesture, an act of trust far more intimate than any touch. He was not just giving her a book, he was giving her a piece of his past, a piece of his heart. He was letting her into the quiet, guarded room of his grief. He was sharing his wife with her, not as a rival, but as a memory to be honored. She opened the cover. On the flyleaf, in a delicate, looping hand, was written Mary Blackwood. And beneath it, as if in answer, she saw the space where her own story was beginning to be written. The blizzard could rage all it wanted. Inside, something fragile and precious was being carefully, quietly built. Spring arrived late, but with a fierce, determined beauty. The snow receded, revealing the pale green shoots of new grass. The creek swelled with meltwater, and the air, for the first time in months, carried the scent of damp earth instead of ice. The world was waking up, and with it, a sense of possibility. Eleanor felt it in her own heart, a lightness that had been absent for years. The ranch was no longer a place of exile. It was home. Then the letter came. It arrived with the circuit preacher, a thin, sallow man who also served as the region's informal postman. The envelope was crisp, the handwriting sharp and familiar. It was from her brother-in-law. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The words were cold and commanding, stripped of any real sentiment. Her sister, his wife, had taken ill. Her condition was delicate. A physician had recommended constant, gentle care. And since Eleanor was, in his words, in a temporary arrangement and with no permanent obligations, it was her clear and familial duty to return to Boston at once. He had enclosed a train ticket, a summons disguised as a provision. Every line was a dismissal of her life in Wyoming. Temporary arrangement, no permanent obligations. The words were like a slap. He saw her existence here as a placeholder, a brief, unimportant chapter before she was recalled to her proper role as a dependent. The letter systematically dismantled the fragile sense of belonging she had so carefully constructed. The old feelings of worthlessness, of being a pawn in other people's lives, rushed back in a suffocating wave. Was he right? Had she just been fooling herself? The arrangement with Silas had been one of convenience. There had been no promises, no declarations. She was just the hired help. Duty, her whole life had taught her, was paramount. A sister's need, a family's claim. These were chains forged long ago. But the thought of leaving was a physical ache, a sharp, tearing pain in her chest, leaving the vast open sky, leaving the quiet satisfaction of her garden, leaving the sound of Jacob's improving reading and Sarah's rare, precious laughter, leaving Silas. The thought was unbearable. For the first time in her life, what she wanted was at war with what she was told she owed. That evening, she found him by the corral, mending a bridle. The setting sun cast long shadows across the yard. She held the letter out to him, her hand shaking. "It's from Boston," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "From my sister's husband." He took it, his eyes scanning her face before dropping to the page. She watched him read, his jaw tightening, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He read it once, then again, as if trying to decipher a language he did not understand. The silence stretched, filled only by the low nicker of a horse and the distant call of a meadowlark. She braced herself, prepared for him to nod, to agree that her duty lay elsewhere, prepared for him to say that it had been a good arrangement, but it was time for it to end. Silas folded the letter with slow, deliberate precision, creasing the paper into a neat square. He did not hand it back to her. He held it in his fist, his knuckles white. The last rays of sunlight caught in his pale eyes, making them burn with an intensity she had never seen before. He looked from the letter to the house where a light now glowed in the window, a beacon of warmth against the coming dusk. He looked at the children's two small ponies, safe in the corral. Finally, his gaze came to rest on her. "This is your home now, Eleanor," he said, his voice low and rough with an emotion she couldn't name. He took a step closer. "If you choose it." He did not command her to stay. He did not plead. He gave her the one thing no one else ever had, a choice, the power to decide her own life. It was a gift so immense it left her breathless. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the years of ingrained obligation warring with the new, fierce love she felt for this place, for this life. He took another step, closing the space between them. "The children," he said, his voice dropping even lower, husky with feeling. We need you." It was not a poem. It was not a grand declaration. But in 3 simple words, he laid his heart bare. "We need you." It was the most honest, most profound thing anyone had ever said to her. She was not a burden to be managed or a duty to be fulfilled. She was needed. She was wanted. She looked past him at the small house glowing against the deep purple of the twilight sky. She saw the mended curtains in the window, the sturdy line of the roof she now knew so well. She heard the echo of children's laughter and the memory of a quiet voice reading by the fire. She saw the face of this weathered, decent man who had taken her in when she had nothing, who had defended her, trusted her, and now was offering her everything. A lifetime of being told what to do, where to go, who to be, fell away like a snake's shed skin. She reached out and took the folded letter from his hand. Without a word, she walked to the small fire he used for heating branding irons. She opened her hand and let the paper drop into the flames. They watched together as her brother-in-law's careful script blackened, curled, and turned to ash, the last tie to her old life dissolving into the Wyoming air. "I choose this," she said, her voice clear and strong. The temporary had become permanent. She was home. 5 years later, spring came to the Blackwood Ranch not as a promise, but as a fulfillment. The cottonwoods along the creek were thick with new leaves, and the pastures were lush and green, dotted with healthy, fat calves. The ranch had prospered. New fences crisscrossed the land, a testament to years of hard shared work. The small sod house now had a proper wooden porch and a new room built onto the side. Eleanor Blackwood sat on the porch swing, a gentle breeze stirring the silvering hair at her temples. She was no longer the pale, haunted woman who had stepped off the train in promise. The sun and wind had etched fine lines around her eyes, but they were lines of laughter, not sorrow. Her hands resting in her lap were strong and capable, no longer at war with the world, but at peace with it. From the porch, she could see Jacob, now a lanky, broad-shouldered young man of 15, working alongside his father, their movements in sync as they repaired a section of fence. They moved with the quiet competence of men who understood each other without words. A moment later, the screen door creaked open and Sarah emerged, carrying a tray with 2 glasses of lemonade. At 14, she had her mother's grace and her father's steady gaze. She had found her voice, and it was often raised in song as she worked. A neighboring ranch wife, a kind German woman, had taken Sarah under her wing and taught her the kitchen alchemy that had always eluded Eleanor. Now the house was often filled with the scent of fresh bread and simmering stews, a testament to Sarah's own quiet competence. She handed her a glass, her smile easy and bright. "Thought you might be thirsty, Mama," she said, the word as natural and comfortable as the worn boards beneath their feet. Eleanor's heart swelled. Chosen, not born. The love was deeper for it. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in strokes of rose and gold, Silas came up the steps, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. He sat beside her on the swing, his familiar weight a comforting presence. He smelled of dust, leather, and sun. He didn't speak, just reached over and took her hand, lacing his calloused fingers through hers. Their hands fit together perfectly, a map of their shared life. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple silver ring, worn smooth with time. It was not new. It was his mother's wedding band. They had been married by the circuit preacher 3 years prior, a simple ceremony by the creek with the children as their only witnesses. This was not a proposal, but an affirmation, a quiet acknowledgement of all they had built. He slipped it onto her finger, over the plain gold band she already wore. "It belonged on your hand," he said simply. She looked from the ring to his beloved, weathered face, and saw her past, her present, and all of her tomorrows. They sat together in the gathering twilight, watching the first stars appear in the vast dark sky. The landscape that had once seemed so terrifying and empty was now the frame for her entire world. It was beautiful. It was home. The world had sent her away as a burden, a woman with nothing of value to offer. But here, in the heart of a quiet man, in the steadfast embrace of the land, she had discovered a truth that resonated deeper than any Boston sermon. She was not just needed, she was chosen, and that, she knew, was worth more than all the gold in the world.